I've never been a big fan of fishing. I mean, don't get me wrong, I've gone a few times, but it's not like I live for it or anything. That's more Mike's thing. My buddy Mike? The guy is obsessed. Always talking about the best fishing spots, the right bait to use, how to reel in the big ones. Me? I'm usually there for the cold beers, the peace and quiet. But this one weekend was different. Mike had this weird look in his eyes, like he knew something he wasn't telling me. We gotta go to Grimstone Lake, he said, tossing his fishing gear into the back of his old, beat-up truck. Grimstone? I stopped, my hand halfway to grabbing the cooler. Isn't that place like abandoned or cursed or something? I tried to laugh it off, but even saying the name gave me a weird feeling in the pit of my stomach. Mike just shrugged, not even looking up from the tackle box. Yeah, people say stuff, but it's just a lake, man. I was out there last weekend, and it's loaded with fish. Nobody else goes, so it's perfect. Yeah, nobody else goes, because they don't want to end up at the bottom of that creepy-ass lake. I muttered, half joking, but something about the idea didn't sit right with me. Mike laughed. You seriously scared of some old stories? It wasn't that I was scared, exactly, but Grimstone had a reputation around town. People said it was bad luck to fish there, that weird things happened. Like the one time an entire family's boat just disappeared, never to be found. Or the rumors about shadows that moved just beneath the water, even on the calmest days. But, as always, Mike brushed it off and somehow he convinced me to tag along. It was supposed to be just another weekend fishing trip, a chance to hang out, have a few beers, and maybe bring home a big catch. I figured, what's the worst that could happen? We hit the road early Saturday morning. The sun wasn't even fully up yet, just a dim orange glow on the horizon as we drove out of town. The closer we got to Grimstone, the quieter the world seemed to get. No birds, no wind, just the sound of the truck's tires crunching over gravel as we pulled up to the lake's edge. I stepped out of the truck and looked around. Grimstone was even worse than I remembered. The water wasn't blue like most lakes. Hell, it wasn't even green. It was this deep, inky black, like it didn't belong to this world. The trees around the shore were all crooked, their branches reaching out like they were trying to grab something. The air felt heavy, like the place was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I shook off the feeling, trying not to look like a chicken in front of Mike. You ready? Mike asked, grinning as he hoisted the boat down from the truck. I just nodded, even though every instinct was telling me to turn around and get back in the truck. We pushed the boat into the water, the sound of it sliding over the rocks echoing around the empty lake. Mike seemed totally unfazed, already talking about the best spots to cast a line. I followed him into the boat, trying to act normal, but something about the silence around us felt unnatural. We rowed out to the middle of the lake, the water so dark and still that it felt like we were floating on oil. This is the spot, Mike said confidently, pulling out his rod and setting up his bait. I wasn't paying much attention to him, though. My eyes were glued to the water. No ripples, no movement, just this vast, flat surface that seemed to go on forever. I kept expecting to see something, anything, pop up, but the lake just sat there, dark and silent. Mike handed me a rod, and I set up my line, trying to ignore the growing tension in my chest. I kept telling myself it was just another fishing trip, nothing to worry about. But as I cast my line into the water and watched the bait sink into the blackness below, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Sitting in that small boat on Grimstone Lake, I felt a knot tightening in my stomach that I just couldn't shake. The sun was still low, casting long shadows over the dark water, and the silence around us was unnerving. Normally, when you're out fishing, you hear all kinds of sounds. The rustling of trees, the splash of water, birds calling from the shore. But here, nothing. It was dead quiet, almost like the whole place was holding its breath. Mike, as usual, seemed completely unbothered. He was sitting across from me, fiddling with his gear, humming some old tune to himself, as if everything was perfectly normal. He even had a smile on his face, like he couldn't be happier to be there. On the other hand, was on edge. The longer I stared at the water, the more it seemed wrong. It wasn't just the color. I mean, I'd seen lakes with dark water before, sure. But this was different. It didn't just look dark, it looked thick, like something was mixed in, making it too heavy to move. Every time I glanced at the surface, I half expected to see something, something just beneath, waiting. But all I saw was my own reflection, distorted in the ripples from the boat. You ever seen water this weird? I asked, trying to keep my voice casual, though the tightness in my chest was growing. Mike shrugged without even looking up. Water's water, man. You worry too much? I frowned, glancing back at the shore. We were far enough out now that it felt like we were completely alone, isolated. The trees around the edge of the lake looked distant, warped by the haze rising from the water. I took a deep breath and tried to focus on the reason we were there, fishing. I wasn't about to let my nerves get the better of me, not in front of Mike. Still, that silence. It didn't sit right. The lake was supposed to be alive, right? Fish, bugs, frogs. Something should have been making noise, but there was nothing. Not even the hum of insects, which was weird for a place like this. I glanced at Mike again, but he was too busy adjusting his rod to notice anything unusual. Remember that family that disappeared out here? I asked, mostly to break the silence. Mike rolled his eyes. You really gonna bring that up now? I mean, it's kind of hard not to think about when you're sitting in the middle of the lake where it happened. Don't you think? Old stories, man, Mike said, casting his line into the water with a smooth flick of his wrist. People like to talk. Someone probably capsized their boat, and the rest is just gossip. I watched his bait sink into the murky depths, disappearing almost instantly. I didn't answer him right away, but the tension in my gut only got worse. Yeah, maybe, I muttered, but I wasn't convinced. Stories didn't come out of nowhere, and Grimstone had too many of them for me to believe it was all just gossip. Still, I cast my own line, trying to focus on fishing like we were supposed to. Mike was already reeling his in and casting again, his rhythm steady, relaxed. I tried to mimic him, but my mind kept drifting back to the stories I'd heard growing up. People saying they'd seen strange things in the water, shadows that didn't belong, shapes that seemed to move in the depths when there was nothing around. Then there were the disappearances, like the family that went out on the lake one afternoon and never came back. No bodies, no boat, just gone. And now here we were, sitting in the middle of that same lake, like it was just any other day. What did you say happened last time you were here? I asked after a while, not expecting much of an answer. Mike shrugged again. I caught a few good ones, nothing special. Didn't stay long, though. Weather was bad, had to pack it up early. I thought about that. Mike wasn't the type to leave just because of bad weather. He'd fished through thunderstorms before, more stubborn than smart sometimes. But I didn't push it. Maybe he just had a bad feeling, too, and didn't want to admit it. As I reeled in my line to cast again, something weird happened. The boat shifted. Not much, but enough to feel it. Like something had bumped into it from below. I froze, my hand gripping the rod, staring at the water around us. You feel that? I asked, my voice a little tighter than I'd meant it to be. Mike raised an eyebrow, but he didn't seem worried. Probably a fish. Big ones down here, told you. I nodded, but my pulse was racing. If that was a fish, it was a hell of a big one to make the boat move like that. I glanced down at the water again, half expecting to see something moving under the surface, but it was just as still and black as before. I tried to laugh it off, but the sound came out shaky. Mike cast his line again, as calm as ever. You're jumpy today, man. Relax. We'll be heading back with a cooler full of fish soon enough. I forced a smile, trying to relax like he said, but that feeling in my gut wasn't going away. I couldn't explain it, but something was wrong with this place. I didn't know what it was yet, but I was sure of one thing. This wasn't just any normal fishing trip. Something was waiting for us out there, beneath that dark, still water. And I had a bad feeling that whatever it was, we wouldn't be able to ignore it for much longer. I had just about managed to settle into the uncomfortable quiet of Grimstone Lake when Mike's sudden shout jolted me upright. Got one, he yelled, his voice breaking the eerie silence as he gripped his fishing rod tight. I turned to look, my heart pounding. Mike's rod was bent at an angle so sharp it looked like it might snap. His reel was spinning like crazy, the line pulling hard into the water. Whatever was on the other end wasn't like any fish I'd ever seen. Holy crap, this thing's a monster, Mike grunted, digging his heels into the bottom of the boat to brace himself. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the rod, and beads of sweat started forming on his forehead. I leaned forward, eyes fixed on the line disappearing into that inky black water. It was so dark, you couldn't see more than a few inches beneath the surface. Whatever was pulling at Mike's line was deep, and it was powerful. "Need a hand?" I asked, more out of instinct than confidence. I wasn't sure how much help I could be if that thing decided to come up. My chest tightened with the same unease I'd been trying to ignore all day. This didn't feel right. "Nah, I got it," Mike said through gritted teeth, even as his arms trembled from the effort. "Just big one, that's all." But as I watched, it became clear this wasn't just a big one. The rod bent further and further, the line creaking under the strain. I had never seen a fish fight back like this, not even the biggest ones we caught in other lakes. The way the boat rocked with every tug of the line made me nervous. Mike might have been good at this, but whatever was on the other end wasn't playing fair. "What the hell is down there?" I muttered, more to myself than anything. The water was still, like it always was, no ripples, no sign of movement, just that heavy, dark nothingness. But the pull on Mike's line told a different story. "I don't know," Mike replied, straining to keep the rod steady. "But it's coming up. I can feel it." The way he said it didn't make me feel any better. He was struggling and hard. His arms were shaking, his face red with the effort, but he wouldn't let go. Typical Mike. Always stubborn, never backing down from a challenge. Normally, I admired that about him, but right now, I just wanted him to cut the damn line. Something about this was wrong. The boat shifted again, rocking more violently as whatever was down there continued to pull. My grip on the edge tightened. We were supposed to be out here for a quiet day of fishing, but this felt like we were in a fight for survival. And we hadn't even seen what we were up against yet. "Mike, seriously," I said, my voice shaking now. "Maybe we should just let it go. Whatever it is, it's not worth..." Snap! The sound of the rod breaking echoed across the lake, louder than it should have been in the still air. Mike stumbled backward, nearly falling into the boat as the line whipped back, the broken end of the rod dangling uselessly in his hands. "What the hell?" Mike gasped, staring at the snapped rod in disbelief. His chest was heaving, his face pale from the shock. It just broke." I stared at him, speechless for a moment. Mike had been fishing for years. He'd caught fish twice my size before, and never once had I seen him lose control like that. And now his best rod had just snapped like a twig. "That wasn't just a fish," I muttered, more to myself than him. The tension in the air had thickened, like the lake was watching us, waiting for what we'd do next. Mike was still staring at the broken rod, his face a mix of confusion and frustration. "There's no way a fish could have done that," he said, his voice quiet now. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something like fear in his eyes. I didn't know what to say. We both knew something was off, something beyond just a broken rod. That thing, whatever it was still down there. And the way it had pulled, the way the boat had rocked, there was no telling what might have happened if Mike hadn't let go when he did. "So, what do we do now?" I asked, though I already knew my answer. We needed to get the hell out of there. But Mike, stubborn as ever, shook his head. "I'm not leaving until I know what that was." "Are you serious?" I stared at him in disbelief. "You're gonna try again after that?" He shot me a look that was both determined and a little crazed. "Look, man, I came out here to catch something big. Whatever that was, it's bigger than anything I've ever seen. I can't just leave without at least knowing what it was." I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell him he was insane. But the look in his eyes told me it was pointless. When Mike set his mind on something, there was no talking him out of it. So I sighed, glancing nervously at the water, and said, "All right, but we're leaving the second things get weirder." "Deal." "Deal," Mike muttered, already digging into his tackle box for a spare rod. I watched him set up again, the tension in my stomach twisting tighter. As much as I hated to admit it, part of me was curious too. Whatever was down there wasn't just a fish. And the fact that it had broken Mike's rod meant it was something else. I didn't know if I wanted to see it or run as far away as possible. Maybe both. Mike cast his line again, the bait disappearing into the dark water, swallowed up by the shadows below. And just like that, we were waiting once more, the silence of Grimstone Lake surrounding us. I tried to calm my racing heart, but deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Mike had barely gotten his new line in the water when the boat shifted again, a slow, unsettling movement that sent ripples through the stillness of the lake. I tightened my grip on the edge, every nerve in my body on high alert. The air around us seemed even heavier now, thick with the same tension that had been building ever since we'd cast our first lines. It was like the lake was waiting for something, waiting for us to make the next move. "I don't know, Mike," I muttered, more to myself than to him. "Maybe we're pushing our luck here." Mike didn't answer right away, his eyes focused intently on the water. He was calm, too calm for my liking. "We're fine," he said, his voice steady, but I could hear the hint of excitement underneath it. He was chasing something now, something bigger than just a fish, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. I wasn't so sure. The way the boat had shifted earlier, the way that rod had snapped like a toothpick, it didn't sit right with me. But Mike, he was in full-on hunter mode, and I knew from experience that once he got like this, there was no talking him down. We sat in silence for a while, the only sound being the occasional clink of the tackle box as Mike adjusted his gear or the soft lapping of the water against the side of the boat. I tried to relax, telling myself that it was just another fishing trip, that we were probably overreacting. But deep down, that creeping sense of dread had taken root, and no matter how hard I tried to push it aside, it was there, growing. Then, out of nowhere, Mike's line went taut again, pulling hard like before. "Here we go," he shouted, his voice full of excitement as he gripped the rod tightly, bracing himself against the sudden force. I watched in disbelief as the line pulled hard into the water, even harder than it had before. This time, the whole boat rocked violently, like something was trying to drag us down with it. I grabbed the sides to steady myself, my heart hammering in my chest. "Mike, cut the line!" I shouted, panic creeping into my voice. "This isn't normal, man. Just cut it." "No way." Mike grunted, pulling with everything he had. His face was red, his muscles straining as the rod bent almost to the point of snapping again. "I'm not letting this one go." The boat rocked again, harder this time, and I could feel the cold sweat on the back of my neck. Whatever was down there wasn't just some big fish. This was something else, something strong enough to pull us around like we were nothing more than a toy boat floating on a pond. I scrambled toward Mike, trying to help him brace against the pull, but it felt like we were fighting a losing battle. His feet were slipping against the bottom of the boat, and with each yank of the line, we were dragged closer to the edge. The water around us remained eerily still, no splashes or disturbances, just that line disappearing into the black depths below. "Mike, seriously, cut the damn line?" I shouted again, my voice more desperate this time. But Mike wasn't listening. His face was twisted in concentration, his jaw clenched so tight, I thought his teeth might crack. He was locked in a fight with whatever was under the water, and it was clear neither of them was willing to back down. Then, in one horrifying moment, the boat lurched forward with such force that Mike lost his footing completely. He stumbled, slipping toward the edge, and before I could react, he was pulled halfway over the side, his upper body dangling above the water. "Mike!" I screamed, lunging toward him. I managed to grab the back of his jacket just in time, my fingers digging into the fabric as I yanked him back with all my strength. For a split second, it felt like something was pulling against me, like something had him by the legs, refusing to let go. Mike's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear now, no longer the calm, confident fisherman who'd started this trip. He was scared, and so was I. "Pull me back," he shouted, panic in his voice for the first time. I dug my heels into the floor of the boat, gritting my teeth as I hauled him back in, inch by inch. The whole time, I could feel resistance, like something was trying to drag him back into the water. My heart raced, and my hands ached from the strain, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Whatever was down there was fighting me just as much as it had been fighting Mike. Finally, with one last heave, I managed to pull him back into the boat. He collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air, his chest heaving with every breath. His rod dangled over the side, the line still pulled tight, but now neither of us had any interest in what was at the other end. Mike sat up, his face pale, his hands trembling as he stared at the water. It had me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I looked at him, confused. "What are you talking about?" He shook his head, still staring at the water. It had my legs, man. I felt it. Something down there. It grabbed me. I swallowed hard. My mouth suddenly dry. I didn't want to believe him, but the look on his face, the fear in his eyes, it was real. Whatever had happened wasn't just in his head. "We need to go," I said, my voice shaky. "We need to get the hell out of here. Now." Mike nodded, still breathing hard, but he didn't argue this time. He just sat there for a moment, staring at the water, before slowly reaching for the line. With trembling hands, he cut it, the sound of the snap echoing louder than it should have in the dead silence of the lake. We both sat there for a second, the boat eerily still now, as if whatever was down there had finally let us go. The silence around us was even heavier, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. Mike looked at me, his face pale, his hands still shaking. "Let's get out of here," he muttered, and this time, I didn't need any convincing. We started rowing back toward the shore, neither of us saying a word, both too rattled to even process what had just happened. The dark water around us seemed to close in, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us from below, something that had almost taken Mike with it. The silence that hung in the air as we rowed back was suffocating. Mike and I were both too shaken to speak, our only focus on getting to shore as fast as possible. My hands gripped the oars so tightly that my knuckles turned white, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Each pull of the oars felt like it took forever, like the boat was barely moving through the water. The shore seemed impossibly far away, and that oppressive weight, the one I'd felt ever since we arrived, was only getting heavier. Mike was sitting hunched over, his eyes wide and distant. He hadn't said a word since he cut the line. His breaths were coming out in shaky gasps, and he kept glancing back at the water, like he was expecting something to rise up from the depths at any moment. His legs were trembling, his hands clutching the sides of the boat like they were his only lifeline. I'd never seen him like this before. Mike wasn't the kind of guy to get scared easily, but whatever had just happened had shaken him to his core. "What the hell happened back there?" I asked, breaking the silence, though I wasn't sure I even wanted to know the answer. Mike didn't look at me. He just stared out at the lake, his voice barely more than a whisper when he finally spoke. I don't know. I've never felt anything like that before. It was like something was down there, something big. It grabbed me, man. I swear it. I felt it wrap around my legs. I stared at him, trying to wrap my head around what he was saying. Are you sure it wasn't just, I don't know, weeds or something? He shook his head violently. No way. This wasn't weeds. It was strong. It was pulling me under. And if you hadn't grabbed me, I don't think I'd be here right now. His words sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to brush it off, to tell myself that he was just freaked out, that maybe his mind was playing tricks on him, but deep down I knew something was wrong with this place. We both felt it, that pull. The way the water seemed unnaturally still, the broken rod, it didn't add up. I rowed harder, my arms burning with the effort. I just wanted to get out of there, to feel solid ground under my feet again. But no matter how fast I rowed, it felt like we weren't making any progress. The water around us stayed the same, dark and endless, and the shore seemed to stretch farther away the more I looked at it. Why isn't this working? I muttered under my breath, glancing over at Mike. He was still staring at the water, his face pale and drawn. We're not moving, he said suddenly, his voice hollow. I froze for a moment, then glanced back at the lake behind us. He was right. Despite all my rowing, the boat was barely moving. It was like the water was holding us in place, refusing to let us leave. My pulse quickened, and a sick feeling twisted in my gut. "Mike, help me row," I said, my voice more urgent now. He nodded, snapping out of his daze, and grabbed the other set of oars. Together, we rowed as hard as we could, but the boat still barely moved. Every pull of the oars felt heavier than the last, like we were dragging the boat through mud instead of water. Sweat dripped down my face, and my arms screamed in protest, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. We had to get out of there. But then, without warning, the boat lurched violently to the side, nearly throwing us both overboard. I grabbed the edge, my heart racing, and Mike did the same. "What the hell was that?" I gasped, looking around wildly. Mike didn't answer. He was staring into the water, his eyes wide with fear. "It's here," he whispered, barely audible. Before I could ask what he meant, the boat lurched again, this time harder, almost tipping us over completely. I scrambled to keep my balance, gripping the edge of the boat with shaking hands. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening, but nothing about this made sense. It felt like something was underneath us, pushing the boat, trying to flip it. "Row!" I shouted, panic surging through me. "We need to move now." But as soon as I said it, something slammed into the bottom of the boat with such force that it knocked me off my seat and onto the floor. Mike was thrown backward, hitting the side of the boat with a dull thud. For a moment, everything was chaos. My vision blurred, my ears ringing from the impact. I scrambled to my knees, my heart hammering in my chest, and looked over the side of the boat. The water was as dark and still as ever, but I knew something was down there. Something was toying with us, and whatever it was big. "Mike!" I shouted, trying to pull him up. He groaned, holding his head, dazed from the impact. "We have to get out of here," he muttered, his voice weak. I didn't need him to tell me twice. I grabbed the oars again, my hands trembling, and started rowing with all my might. This time, the boat moved slowly at first, then faster. I could feel the water resisting, pulling at us, but we were making progress. The shore was getting closer, inch by agonizing inch. Then, just as I thought we might actually make it, the boat jerked violently again, this time pulling us backward. I glanced over the side in horror as the water started swirling, forming a vortex around us. It was as if the lake itself was alive, dragging us back toward its center. "No, no, no!" I shouted, pulling at the oars, but it was useless. The boat was spinning now, being sucked into the swirling water, and no amount of rowing was going to stop it. Mike was gripping the sides of the boat, his face pale with terror. "It's got us, man. It's got us." My mind raced, searching for some way out, but there was nothing. We were trapped, caught in the lake's grip, and there was no escape. The boat tilted again, and I felt myself sliding toward the edge, my heart pounding in my throat. I reached out, grabbing onto anything I could to stop myself from falling in, but it was no use. The boat was tipping, and the water was rising up to meet me. In that moment, as I stared into the dark, swirling depths of Grimstone Lake, I realized something terrible. We weren't just fighting the water. We were fighting something ancient, something that had been lurking beneath the surface for longer than we could imagine, something that wasn't going to let us leave. The boat was spinning faster now, pulled by the swirling water beneath us, and my grip on the edge was slipping. The cold wind whipped against my face as I fought to stay inside, my body leaning dangerously close to the dark surface. Mike was in no better shape. He was gripping the other side, his face pale and his eyes wide, but there was nothing either of us could do. The lake had us, and it wasn't letting go. "Hold on," I shouted, though I wasn't sure how much longer I could follow my own advice. Suddenly, the boat jerked violently, tilting toward the edge of the vortex. I felt my stomach lurch as the water seemed to rise up to meet us. My legs slipped out from under me, and for a moment, I thought I was going over. I reached out, grabbing Mike's arm, and he grabbed mine. We held on to each other, the only thing keeping us from being sucked into whatever waited below. The water beneath us churned, swirling faster and faster, like the lake itself was alive, a living creature with a hunger we couldn't understand. I looked over the side, my heart pounding in my chest, and for the first time, I saw something moving just below the surface. It wasn't a fish, and it wasn't debris. It was something massive. Its shadow rippled in the dark water, stretching impossibly wide, and as it moved, the water seemed to ripple with it. "What the hell is that?" I gasped, my voice barely audible over the rushing water. "I don't know," Mike shouted back, his voice trembling with fear. "But it's coming." As if in answer, the boat lurched again, tilting even further. The cold water splashed over the side, soaking us both. Mike let out a curse, his grip slipping as his legs dangled dangerously close to the edge. I grabbed him tighter, pulling with all my strength, but the force of the water was overwhelming. It felt like invisible hands were pulling us toward the center, dragging us down, deeper and deeper. "We're not going to make it," Mike shouted, panic rising in his voice. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that we could still fight, but I couldn't. Not when I felt it too, the inevitability of it. The lake was stronger than us, older, more powerful. Whatever was in that water had been waiting, and we'd walked right into its trap. Just as I thought it was over, that we were about to be pulled under for good, the boat stopped spinning. Everything went still, eerily still, like the lake had decided to pause, to toy with us. Mike and I were breathing hard, clutching the sides of the boat, our eyes wide with disbelief. "What the hell?" Mike whispered, his voice shaking. We both sat there, drenched and trembling, the silence around us heavy, almost unbearable. The swirling water had disappeared, and the boat was now floating eerily still in the middle of the lake. The only sound was our ragged breathing, and for a moment, it felt like maybe, just maybe, we had escaped whatever had been dragging us down. But then, the silence broke. A deep, low groan echoed from beneath the water. It was unlike anything I had ever heard, a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth, vibrating through the boat and into our bones. I froze, my heart pounding as I looked at Mike. His face was pale, his eyes locked on the water. "It's still here," he whispered. Before I could respond, the boat lurched violently again, this time from underneath. I felt it lift off the water, just for a second, as if something enormous had hit it from below. I barely had time to grab onto the side before the boat tipped, spilling us both into the freezing water. I gasped as the cold hit me like a shockwave, my body going rigid as the icy water closed in around me. My head went under, and for a terrifying moment, all I could hear was the rushing of water in my ears, the cold squeezing my chest tight. I kicked my legs frantically, desperate to get back to the surface. I broke through, gasping for air, my arms thrashing in the water. I turned, looking for Mike, but the dark water made it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. "Mike!" I shouted, my voice hoarse and panicked. "Mike, where are you?" I heard a splash to my left and turned just in time to see him break through the surface, gasping for air. He was coughing, struggling to stay afloat, his eyes wild with terror. "Swim!" I yelled, the word barely escaping my lips. "Swim for the shore!" We both started swimming, kicking as hard as we could, but the water was heavy, pulling us back with every stroke. The shore still seemed impossibly far, and with every second that passed, I felt the weight of the lake pulling us down again. Suddenly, Mike screamed. I turned just in time to see him being dragged under, his body disappearing into the black water with a splash. My heart stopped, and for a second, I couldn't move. It was as if time itself had frozen, my brain refusing to process what I had just seen. Then, without thinking, I dove under. The water was freezing, dark, and disorienting. I kicked my legs, reaching out blindly in the direction Mike had gone. I couldn't see anything. It was as if the lake had swallowed him whole, and I was next. My lungs burned from the cold, but I kept going, refusing to let go. I reached out, my hands searching through the water, and finally, by some miracle, I grabbed onto something, Mike's jacket. I pulled with all my strength, kicking hard, my lungs screaming for air. For a moment, it felt like I was pulling against the weight of the entire lake, like something down there was holding him tight. But then, suddenly, he came free, and we broke the surface together, both of us gasping for breath. "We have to get out of here," I shouted, my voice raw and desperate. Mike didn't argue this time. We both started swimming again, our strokes frantic, fueled by pure survival. The shore was getting closer now, but I could feel something behind us, something moving in the water. I didn't dare look back. I just kept swimming, my heart pounding in my chest, every muscle burning with exhaustion. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, my feet hit the bottom, and I stumbled onto the shore, dragging Mike with me. We collapsed onto the rocks, gasping for breath, our bodies trembling from the cold and the fear. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. We just lay there, staring up at the sky, grateful to be alive. After a while, Mike sat up, his face pale and drawn. He looked out at the lake, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, his voice shaky. I didn't have an answer. I wasn't even sure I wanted one. Whatever was in Grimstone Lake wasn't natural, and it wasn't something we were meant to understand. We had come too close to finding out what lurked beneath the surface, and we had barely escaped with our lives. "We're never coming back here," I said, my voice flat, final. Mike nodded, still staring at the water. "Never." We got to our feet, shaky and exhausted, and without another word, we turned our backs on Grimstone Lake. We never spoke of it again. Whatever curse that lake carried, we'd left it behind, along with a part of ourselves.